She slammed the letter into the fireplace before the ink could even dry. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, not from exhaustion, but from the one name written at the bottom of that letter. A name she had spent 3 years running from. A name that now sat at the top of London's most powerful guest list, printed in bold beside one terrible title. The Duke of Crestmore had arrived, and he was asking for her by name. Not the name she was using now, not Miss Daphne Collis, the quiet seamstress who kept her head down and her past buried. He had written her real name, the one only he knew, the one that could unravel everything she had built from nothing, every lie, every careful step, every small mercy she had stolen from a world that owed her none. She pressed her back against the cold wall and squeezed her eyes shut. 3 years ago, she had walked out of Crestmore Hall with nothing but a secret heavy enough to break a woman in half. She had told herself she would never go back. She had told herself he would forget her. Men like Duke Harlan Veyrick didn't waste their attention on women like her. They moved on. They married well. They forgot. But Harlan Veyrick hadn't forgotten, because 2 hours later, his carriage stopped directly in front of her door. She heard the wheels on the cobblestone before she saw anything. She heard the silence that followed, that specific, suffocating silence that only power could produce. And then she heard his footsteps, slow, deliberate, like a man who had never once been told no and had no intention of starting today. She did not run. There was nowhere left to go. The knock on her door was not loud. It did not need to be. And when she finally opened it, he was already looking at her like he knew every single thing she had tried so hard to hide. "Did you really think," he said, his voice low and unbothered, "that I would not find you? Now, before we go any further, tell me this. If you were her, standing at that door with a secret that could destroy everything, would you tell him the truth or protect it with your last breath?" Drop your answer in the comments, and if this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now. We are just getting started, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. The morning Daphne Collis burned that letter, she had exactly 4 shillings left to her name, a broken window latch, and a secret that had been quietly eating her alive for 3 years. She stood in the middle of her small rented room on Greywick Lane and watched the last corner of the paper curl black and disappear into the fire. The smell of it filled the room, sharp, final, like a door slamming shut on something she had foolishly hoped was already dead. She had worked hard to become nobody. That was not a small thing. Becoming nobody required discipline. It required silence, careful steps, and the willingness to cut away every part of yourself that made you memorable. Daphne had done all of it. She had left behind her accent, softened it into something plain and forgettable. She had traded her good dresses for simple ones. She had stopped laughing loudly in public because laughter drew attention, and attention was dangerous. She had made herself into a grey, quiet, unremarkable woman, and for 3 years it had worked. Until now. She pulled her shawl tighter and moved to the window. Outside, Greywick Lane was already alive with the ordinary sounds of the morning. A cart vendor calling out prices. 2 women arguing over a shared fence. A dog barking somewhere far off. Normal things. Safe things. The kind of things that reminded her why she had chosen this particular street, this particular life. Nobody on Greywick Lane knew her real name. Nobody knew where she came from. Mrs. Portman, her landlady, thought she was the widow of a minor tradesman. The girls at the seamstress shop where she worked believed she was simply quiet and private. Old Mr. Fitch next door had once told her she had the eyes of someone carrying grief, and she had smiled and said nothing, because he was not entirely wrong. She had built this life the way you build a dam, one stone at a time, careful, steady, always aware that water was pressing against the other side. Now the dam has cracked. She turned away from the window and began to dress. Her fingers moved through the familiar routine, buttons, pins, hair twisted and pinned back without a mirror. She had stopped needing mirrors a long time ago. Mirrors showed you your own face, and her face was the one thing about herself she could not change. It was the same face he would recognize, the same cheekbones, the same dark eyes, the same mouth that had once said things to him she could never take back. Harlan Varick, even thinking his name felt dangerous, like pressing a finger against a bruise that had never fully healed. She did not say it out loud. She never said it out loud. But it lived in her chest like a stone, heavy and permanent, and no matter how many months passed, it never seemed to get any lighter. She remembered the first time she had seen him. Not in the romantic way that women in parlor novels described, not with soft light and gentle music and a feeling like floating. It had been raining the Isange Inn, first time she saw Harlan Varick. She had been standing outside Crestmore Hall with a letter from her father, waiting to be let in by a footman who clearly resented the task. And he had come around the side of the house on horseback, soaked through, his dark hair flat against his forehead, shouting at someone about a fence that had come down in the east field. He had not noticed her at all that first day. She had noticed everything about him. That was the beginning of her greatest mistake, though she had not known it yet. She had been 19 then, freshly arrived as a companion to his elderly aunt, Lady Maren Varick, a sharp-tongued but surprisingly kind woman who smelled of lavender and rarely slept past 5 in the morning. The position had been arranged through her father, a former solicitor, whose failing health had made him desperate to secure Daphne's future before he could no longer provide for it himself. It was not a glamorous arrangement, but it was safe, and it paid. For the first 6 months at Crestmore Hall, Daphne had done everything right. She had been attentive and obedient. She had read to Lady Maren every evening. She had kept her opinions inside her mouth where they belonged. She had avoided the Duke as much as any person could avoid someone in whose house they lived, which was to say, not very successfully at all. Crestmore Hall was enormous, but Harlan Varick filled it. Not with noise. He was not a loud man. He filled it with presence, the kind that made a room shift slightly when he walked into it, the kind that made people straighten their posture without being asked. He had a way of looking at things, not people, but objects, windows, fireplaces, the spines of books, as if he were measuring them against some internal standard they were probably failing. And then sometimes he would look at a person with that same careful, measuring gaze, and it felt like being read. He had looked at Daphne that way for the first time 7 months into her stay. She had been in the library, which she had been explicitly told was not a space for the staff, but Lady Maren had sent her to find a specific volume of poetry, and Daphne had taken longer than she should have, because she had started reading something else entirely, standing between 2 shelves with a book open in her hands like she owned the place. She had not heard him come in. "That is a first edition," he said, from somewhere behind her left shoulder. She had startled so badly she nearly dropped it. She spun around, pressed the book to her chest with both hands, and found him standing 4 feet away with an expression that was not quite amusement, but was definitely something other than anger. "I am sorry," she said. "Lady Maren asked me to find a volume of Keats, and I was searching, and then I found this, and I should not have opened it. I am sorry. I will put it back exactly where I found it." He tilted his head slightly. "Which poem?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon? Which poem were you reading?" She looked down at the book in her hands, still pressed against her chest like a shield. "Ode to a Nightingale." Something in his expression shifted, just barely. "And what did you think of it?" Nobody had ever asked Daphne what she thought about a poem, not once in her life. She had read plenty of poetry. She had thought plenty of things about it. But the question itself caught her so off guard that the honest answer fell out of her mouth before she could stop it. I think it is beautiful and devastating, and that the poet was probably exhausted when he wrote it. The kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than sleep. A long pause. And then, unexpectedly, Harlan Varick almost smiled. "Leave it on the table when you are done," he said, and walked out. She stood there for a full minute after he left, heart hammering, book still clutched to her chest, absolutely certain she had made a terrible and irreversible error. She had been right. Not because of what happened that day. That day was innocent. What happened after was slower and far more dangerous. It built the way fire builds when nobody is watching it. Glances across rooms, brief, accidental conversations in hallways, a book left on a side table with a passage underlined and no name attached, though she knew his handwriting by then. A question asked through Lady Maren, carefully indirect, about whether Miss Collis might have an opinion on the proposed renovations to the East Garden. She should have stopped it earlier. She knew that now. She had known it then, if she was being honest. But knowing a thing is dangerous, and choosing to step away from it are two entirely different acts. And Daphne had always been better at knowing than at stepping away. By the time she understood what was happening between them, it was already too far gone to undo. And then Lady Maren had died. Quietly, in her sleep, on a Tuesday morning in late November, with a half-finished piece of embroidery still in her lap. Daphne had found her. She had sat beside the chair for a long time before she called anyone, not because she was in shock, though she was, but because she had understood in that moment that Lady Maren's death changed everything. The position that had kept Daphne at Crestmore Hall was gone. The buffer between her and Harlan Varick, the careful, socially acceptable reason for her presence, was gone. She had begun packing that same evening. He had found her at it. She could still see the exact look on his face when he came through the doorway of her small room and found her folding dresses into a trunk. Not anger. Not surprise. Something quieter than both of those things. Something that had no clean name. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. "My position here is finished," she said, and kept folding. "I am offering you another one." She stopped. She did not turn around. "What position?" The silence that followed was the longest 3 seconds of her life. "You know what I am asking," he said. She did know. And that was the problem, because she also knew things he didn't know yet. Things she had discovered only 4 days earlier. Things she had been trying to find the courage to tell him. Things that now rose up in her throat like a tide she could not hold back. She turned around. She looked at him standing in the doorway, tall and certain, and looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a shifting world. And she understood that if she stayed, the secret she was carrying would destroy them both. So she did the only thing she could think of. She told him she didn't love him. She said it clearly and without flinching, looking directly at his face, because she knew that looking away would make it unconvincing. She told him that her time at Crestmore Hall had been a professional arrangement, that whatever he imagined existed between them was a misreading, that she was grateful for his aunt's kindness and for the position, and that she wished him well. She watched something go out in his eyes, and then she picked up her trunk and she walked out of Crestmore Hall, and she did not look back. She had been looking forward ever since, not because forward was easier, but because looking back would have broken her completely, and Daphne Collis did not have the luxury of being broken. She had a secret to protect, and now, 3 years later, the man she had lied to was standing outside her door. She opened the door because she had no other choice. That was what she told herself, standing there with her hand on the latch, her pulse loud in her ears, the sound of his single knock still hanging in the air like something that could not be taken back. She opened it, because running would only delay the inevitable, and she was too tired for running. She had been running for 3 years, and the exhaustion of it had settled into her bones like damp cold. But the moment she saw him, she understood that no amount of reasoning could have prepared her for this. Harlan Varick stood on her narrow doorstep, looking exactly like himself, which was to say, like a man carved from certainty and discipline, dressed in dark riding clothes, no hat, hair slightly disordered from the wind, jaw set in that familiar way that meant he was controlling something tightly. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply spent 3 years making him smaller in her memory, so that she could survive him. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "You look tired." Of all the things she had braced herself to hear, that was not among them. Not accusations, not demands, not the hard, cold voice of a man who had been lied to and had come to collect something. Just that. Simple and quiet, and somehow the most disarming thing he could have said. "I am fine," she said. "May I come in?" "No." He nodded slowly, as if that answer was reasonable, as if he had expected it. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a small folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. She did not take it. "It is not a threat," he said. "Everything about your presence here is a threat," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the only small mercy the moment offered. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not hurt. Something older than hurt. "I came alone," he said. "No staff. No solicitor. No announcement. Just me. That is supposed to be reassuring. It is supposed to be honest." She looked at the paper still extended between them. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the door. "What is it?" "A letter that arrived at Crestmore Hall 6 weeks ago," he said. "It was addressed to you, under your real name. It came from a woman called Mrs. Fay Alton in Hertfordshire. I believe you know who she is." The blood left Daphne's face so completely that she felt the cold rush of it all the way down to her feet. She knew who Mrs. Fay Alton was. She knew exactly who she was, and the knowledge of it hit her like a physical blow, sudden and breathtaking, and absolutely without mercy. Her hand moved on its own. She took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, though every part of her wanted to tear it open. The handwriting inside was cramped and anxious, the letters pressing hard into the page. She read it once, then again. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest the same way she had once pressed his book 3 years ago in a library that felt like another lifetime. "You read it," she said. It was not an accusation. It was simply a fact. "No," he said. "It was sealed. I brought it to you because it had your name on it, and because I thought—" He paused. "I thought you might need it." She looked up at him. His expression was careful, controlled, but his eyes were doing something she recognized, something she had spent 3 years trying to forget, that particular way he had of looking at her, as if the rest of the room simply ceased to exist. "You tracked me here," she said. "Yes." "How long have you known where I was?" A pause. 4 months. Something cold moved through her. 4 months, and you waited until now. "I waited until I had a reason that was not about me," he said quietly. She stood there in her doorway on Greywick Lane, with his letter against her chest, and Mrs. Fay Alton's words burning through the paper and into her skin, and she thought, with extraordinary clarity, that she was not going to cry. She absolutely was not going to cry in front of Harlan Varick. "You need to leave," she said. "Daphne." The sound of her real name in his mouth, her actual name, the one only he knew, hit her somewhere deep and undefended. She had not heard it spoken aloud in 3 years. She had not realized how much she had missed it until it was suddenly there in the air between them, warm and precise, and completely unfair. "Please," she said. He studied her for a moment. Then he reached into his coat again and produced a card, plain white with an address written on it in his own hand. "I'm staying at Harwick House on Pemfield Street. Not Crestmoor. Not anywhere connected to society, just a rented house." He set the card on the narrow ledge beside her door. "When you are ready to talk, come find me. I will not come back here uninvited." "I will not come." "Then you will not come," he said simply. He stepped back. He turned. He walked down her narrow front path and back toward the street, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world, as if he was not the most dangerous thing to her continued survival, as if he had not just dropped a live coal into the middle of her carefully constructed life. She watched him until he turned the corner. Then she went back inside, closed the door, locked it, and sat down on the floor of her hallway because her legs stopped working. She opened the letter again. Mrs. Fay Alton had written it in a hurry. That much was clear from the slanted lines and the blotted ink, but the message itself was short and devastating in its simplicity. She had written to say that she could no longer continue the arrangement, that she was unwell, that she needed Daphne to come, that there were things that could not be managed without her, that she was deeply sorry, and that the child was asking for her. The child. Daphne pressed her knuckles against her mouth and breathed through her nose, slow and controlled, the way she had taught herself to breathe when things became unbearable. The child's name was Oliver. He had just turned 3 years old. He had dark hair and dark eyes, and a particular way of tilting his head when he was thinking that she recognized from a man she had done everything in her power to forget. Oliver was the secret. Oliver was the reason she had walked out of Crestmoor Hall with her heart in pieces and her spine straight. Oliver was the reason she had spent 3 years building a dam and refusing to look backward. Oliver was Harlan Varick's son, and now Harlan Varick was in London, and Mrs. Alton, who had been keeping Oliver safe and quiet in a cottage in Hertfordshire, was ill and overwhelmed and reaching out for help. Daphne sat on her cold hallway floor and looked at the ceiling and understood that her life, as she had built it, was over. The only question now was what happened next. She got up. She went to her small writing desk. She found paper and a pen and wrote a letter to Mrs. Alton first, short and reassuring, promising to come within the week. Then she sat for a long time with a second blank piece of paper in front of her. She thought about the card he had left on the ledge beside her door. She thought about Oliver asking for her. She thought about the look on Harlan's face when she had told him 3 years ago that she didn't love him, the thing that had gone out in his eyes. She had replayed that moment more times than she could count, turning it over in the dark before sleep, wondering if she had done the right thing, always arriving at the same answer. She had protected him. That was what she told herself. She had protected him from the scandal of a son born outside marriage, from the judgment of a society that would have used it to strip him of everything he had worked for. She had protected Oliver from growing up as a shameful secret in a world that was very unkind to shameful secrets. She had done the hard, painful, selfless thing. But sitting here now, with his card in one hand and Mrs. Alton's letter in the other, she was no longer entirely sure that selflessness and cowardice had not looked exactly the same from the outside. She did not write the second letter that night, but in the morning, when she woke up earlier than usual with a heaviness in her chest and the particular kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night, she got up, walked to the front door, and looked at his card still sitting on the narrow ledge where he had placed it. She picked it up. She held it for a long time, and then she went inside to get her coat. She almost did not go. She stood outside Harwick House, on Pemfield Street, for 4 full minutes, her hand tight around the strap of her bag, watching the front door like it might do something threatening on its own. The house was modest by ducal standards, narrow-fronted and quiet, with no crest above the door and no livery visible anywhere. He had meant what he said about discretion. That should have reassured her. It did not. She knocked. A manservant answered almost immediately, which meant she had been watched for those 4 minutes, which meant Harlan already knew she had hesitated. That small humiliation settled in her chest as she was shown through a narrow hallway and into a sitting room at the back of the house. He was standing at the window when she entered. He did not turn around straight away. He let her stand there for a moment, long enough to feel it, and then he turned and gestured toward the chair across from a small writing desk without a word. She did not sit. "I am here," she said. "Say what you came to say." He studied her for a moment. Then he moved to the desk and sat down behind it, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. He opened a leather folder that had been sitting there already. Inside it, she could see papers, several of them. Her eyes moved over them quickly, and her stomach tightened. "I thought we were having a conversation," she said. "We are," he said. "Sit down, Daphne." "I prefer to stand." "I know." He looked up at her. "Sit down anyway." Something in his voice had changed from the day he appeared at her door. That day, he had been careful with her, measured, almost gentle in the way that men are gentle when they are trying not to frighten something away. That version of him was gone. The man behind this desk was cooler, more contained. The version of Harlan Veyrick that sat across boardrooms and won. She sat down. He looked at the papers in front of him and said, without any preamble at all, "Tell me about the child in Hertfordshire." The room went completely still. Daphne's hands were in her lap. She pressed them flat against her thighs and held herself very steady and said, "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do." He did not look up from the folder. "His name is Oliver. He is 3 years old. He has been living in a cottage outside the village of Branton with a woman called Mrs. Fay Alton, who was paid quarterly from an account registered under the name D. Marsh." He turned a page. "D. Marsh is a name you used briefly in the winter of your first year in London, before you settled on Daphne Collis." He looked up. "Would you like to continue telling me you do not know what I mean?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Daphne had ever sat inside. She looked at him across the desk, this man she had loved quietly and desperately, and then ran from, and felt something shift in the room between them. It was not warmth. It was not the careful tension of their old library moments. It was something harder than all of that. Something with edges. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About the child specifically?" 3 weeks. He closed the folder. "About the account and the cottage, longer. I had a man following the money. I did not know what I was looking for until I found it." "You had someone following my money." "I had someone following every trace you left behind," he said simply. "I told you I waited 4 months before coming to you. I spent those 4 months making sure I understood the full picture before I walked through your door." She felt the cold of it move through her. Not his knowledge. She had always known that Harlan was thorough. What moved through her was the understanding that she had never been as hidden as she believed, that the safety she had built so carefully had been, at least in part, an illusion. "Say it plainly," she said. Her voice came out proud and even, which cost her considerably. "Whatever you came here to say it without the folder and the papers. Look at me and say it." He closed the folder. He leaned back slightly. He looked at her. "Oliver is my son," he said. "You knew it when you left Crestmore Hall. You have kept him from me for 3 years. And that ends today. You do not know that he is yours. I do. No heat in it, no defensiveness, just a flat, certain statement from a man who had already done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer he was completely confident in. Do not insult us both by arguing that point. She stood up. She could not sit still for this. You have no legal claim. I have every legal claim, he said quietly. He carries my blood. I have documentation of the payments. I have witnesses who can place you at Crestmore Hall during the relevant period. I have a solicitor named Mr. Gideon Price, who has been preparing the necessary filings for 11 days. He paused. Sit down. No. She put her hands on the edge of his desk and leaned forward. You want to talk about legal claims? Let us talk about what it would mean for Oliver if you pursue this through the courts. Let us talk about what happens to a 3-year-old boy when his existence becomes a matter of public record and society gets to decide what he is worth. You would drag him through that? You would use him as a document in a legal folder? Something moved in Harlan's expression. A tightening. But he did not look away, and he did not yield. What I would drag him through is nothing compared to what he is already living. Hidden, unnamed, kept in a cottage by a woman who is now ill and cannot manage. He stood up, slowly, and they were suddenly both standing on opposite sides of his desk, close enough that she could see the exact steadiness in his eyes. I am not doing this to punish you. I am doing this because he is mine, and I will not leave my son in the dark because his mother decided unilaterally that hiding him was the kindest option. I was protecting him. You were protecting yourself. The words landed like a slap, precise and accurate, and completely without mercy. She straightened. Her jaw tightened. She felt the heat of anger rise up through her chest and was grateful for it, because anger was cleaner than the other things pressing behind it. You want to talk about what I was protecting, she said. I was 19 years old. I was a companion in your house with no family, no money, and no position. If I had told you, what exactly would you have done? Married me quietly and ruined your name? Paid me off and sent me to the country? The world you live in does not make space for women in my situation, and you know it. You did not give me the chance to decide, because I already knew the options. You knew nothing, he said, and for the first time there was something beneath the controlled surface of his voice, something that had been waiting 3 years for this exact conversation. You decided for both of us without asking. You looked at me and decided I was the kind of man who would choose his reputation over his child, over you. A pause. Was that truly what you thought of me? She opened her mouth, closed it, because the honest answer was no. She had never thought he was that kind of man. She had run, not because she believed he would abandon Oliver, but because she had been terrified of what staying would cost him, and somewhere underneath that, terrified of being something he hadn't chosen freely, a problem he felt obligated to solve. But she was not going to say that. Not here. Not now, with his solicitor's papers sitting in a folder between them. What do you want? She said instead. I want my son brought to London within the fortnight, he said. I want him properly housed and properly named, and I want you in a position where you cannot disappear again. And what position is that? He held her gaze without blinking. My wife. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Everything rippled. That is not a proposal, she said. That is a sentence. Yes, he said. It is. She stared at him, at the absolute, unmoving certainty on his face, at the man who had stood outside her door 2 days ago and been almost careful with her, almost gentle, and who had now placed her inside a corner, so clean and precise she could not find a single wall to push against. I will not be claimed as property, she said. You hid my child from me for 3 years, he said. You do not get to choose the terms anymore. That is not cruelty. That is the consequence. She held his gaze for as long as she could. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the door. "This conversation is not finished," he said behind her. "I need air," she said, and walked out. She made it to the end of Pemfield Street before her legs slowed. She stood at the corner with one hand against a lamppost and breathed. The city moved around her, indifferent and loud, completely unaware that her entire life had just been restructured without her permission. He had said wife, not arrangement, not agreement, wife. And the most terrifying part was not the word itself. The most terrifying part was the small, traitorous piece of her that had heard it and felt, beneath all the fear and fury, something dangerously close to relief. She spent 2 days trying to find a way out. Not emotionally, practically. She sat at her small writing desk on Greywick Lane and went through every angle with the cold focus of a woman who had survived on her own wits for 3 years and was not ready to stop now. She wrote lists. She crossed them out. She wrote them again. She could take Oliver and run. She knew how to disappear. She had done it before. But she also knew that Harlan had a man who had followed her money, and that the version of her hiding that had worked 3 years ago would not work against the version of Harlan she had sat across from 2 days ago. He was not the man who had almost smiled at her in a library. He was something older and more resolved than that, and he had 11 days of legal preparation behind him. She could fight him through a solicitor of her own. She had almost no money, and he had Gideon Price, whose name she had looked up the same evening and discovered was one of the most formidable legal minds currently practicing in London. That option died quickly. She could go to society, tell her side before he could control the narrative. But society would not take the side of a former companion who had hidden a duke's heir. Society would hand her the worst version of that story and use it to entertain itself for a season. Every door she tried was already closed. On the morning of the 3rd day, she received a visitor she had not expected. The knock at her door was sharp and quick, nothing like Harlan's single unhurried knock. She opened it to find a woman of about 50, well-dressed, with bright, assessing eyes, and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades being important in rooms, and intended to continue doing so. She was holding a small card between 2 fingers, extended toward Daphne with the manner of someone presenting credentials. The card read, Mrs. Honoria Bletch, matron of the Pemfield Ladies' Society. "Miss Collis," said the woman pleasantly. "May I come in? I have been asked to speak with you." "By whom?" Daphne said. "By no one you would expect," said Mrs. Bletch, and smiled in a way that contained several things at once. "That is rather the point." Daphne let her in, because curiosity was stronger than caution, which had always been one of her more dangerous qualities. She made tea she could not afford to waste, and sat across from Mrs. Honoria Bletch in her small sitting room, and waited. "You are in a difficult position," said Mrs. Bletch, stirring her tea with the calm of someone discussing the weather. "I am fine," said Daphne. "You are cornered by one of the most powerful men in England, and you have no legal protection, and a child in Hertfordshire whose existence is now known to at least 3 people beyond yourself." Mrs. Bletch set her spoon down. "You are not fine, but you could be." Daphne watched her carefully. "Who sent you?" "A man named Mr. Calder Fenn," said Mrs. Bletch. "He is, as I understand it, interested in certain aspects of the Duke of Crestmore's situation. He believes you might share that interest." Calder Fenn. Daphne had heard that name once, briefly, in a conversation she had half overheard at Crestmore Hall years ago. A distant relation of the Varick family, someone who stood to inherit if the ducal line failed to produce a legitimate heir. Oliver's existence, properly documented, would eliminate that inheritance entirely. "Mr. Fenn wants to use me," Daphne said flatly. "Mr. Fenn wants to help you," said Mrs. Bletch. "Those are the same thing." Mrs. Bletch tilted her head. He is prepared to offer you legal support, financial security, and a position abroad if you choose not to cooperate with the Duke's arrangements. All he asks in return is that the child's parentage remain undocumented. Daphne set down her cup very slowly. He wants Oliver kept illegitimate, so that Fenn's inheritance stays intact. He wants you to have options, said Mrs. Bletch, with the smoothness of a woman who had delivered ugly things in pretty packaging for a long time. Get out of my house, said Daphne. Mrs. Bletch did not move immediately. She looked at Daphne with those bright, measuring eyes, and something in her expression shifted into something almost genuine. I am not your enemy, Miss Collis. I am simply a messenger. But I will tell you this without instruction from anyone. Calder Fenn is not a man you want behind you, and the Duke of Crestmore is not a man you want against you. She stood. Choose your corner carefully. She left. Daphne sat in the quiet of her small room and felt the walls close in by another inch. That same afternoon, a second knock. This one she recognized. She opened the door and found not Harlan, but a young man she did not know, sharply dressed, carrying a leather satchel with the focused energy of someone who worked on schedules and took them seriously. Miss Collis, he said briskly, I am Mr. Gideon Price. I represent the Duke of Crestmore. I have been asked to deliver these. He held out a sealed envelope, and to wait for your response. She took the envelope. Inside was a single page. At the top, in Harlan's handwriting, was a date. 12 days from today. At the bottom, 2 sentences. The arrangements will be finalized by this date with or without your cooperation. I would prefer it. She looked at Mr. Price, standing on her doorstep with his satchel and his schedule, and understood that this was what cold and legal looked like from the inside. No raised voices. No dramatic ultimatums delivered in the heat of feeling. Just a date and a preference, and the absolute, immovable weight of a man who had already decided. Tell him, she said, that I will come to him myself. Mr. Price nodded, made a small note, and left. She went to Harwick House that evening. He was in the same sitting room, standing at the same window. This time he turned when she entered, and she did not wait for him to speak. You cannot simply arrange my life on a piece of paper and give me 12 days, she said. I gave you the courtesy of a timeline, he said. Most people in my position would not. Most people in your position did not have a woman run from them for 3 years, she said. So perhaps the usual rules do not apply. Something moved in his jaw. Not anger, control. What do you want to say? I want to say that Oliver is not a legal matter. He is a child. He is 3 years old, and he has already had enough instability for one short life, and I will not have him handed between solicitors and arrangements and titled obligations like a parcel. Her voice rose slightly. She brought it back down. If you want to be his father, be his father. But you will do it because you choose to, not because your paperwork gives you the right. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. I do choose to. Then prove it without the deadline. No. Flat. Immediate. The deadline stays, because without it, you will find another angle, another door, another way to convince yourself that running is protection. He took a step toward her. Not fast, just deliberate. The way everything he did was deliberate. I know you, Daphne. I have spent 3 years thinking about nothing else with any real attention. You do not run because you are afraid of me. You run because you are afraid of what staying costs you. And I am telling you, as clearly as I know how, that the cost of staying is not what you think it is. She held her ground. He was close now, closer than they had stood since the evening in her room at Crestmore Hall, and the proximity of him was doing things to her composure that she resented deeply. You said wife, she said, like it was a verdict. It is, he said, but it is also a choice I made. Do you understand the difference? You are not giving me a choice. I am giving you the only choice that matters, he said. Come willingly, or come because you have no other option. Either way, you come. But one of those roads is easier than the other. And I am asking you not as a duke, not through Mr. Price, but as the man who has not stopped thinking about you for 3 years to take the easier road. She looked up at him. Pride and fury and something she refused to name were all pressing against each other in her chest. You think this is easy? No, he said quietly. I think it is the hardest thing either of us will ever do, and I think we should do it anyway. The room was very quiet. From outside came the faint sound of a carriage on cobblestone, ordinary and distant, and completely indifferent to the 2 people standing inside this house, deciding the shape of the rest of their lives. Then the sitting-room door opened. They both turned. In the doorway stood Mrs. Fay Alton, travel-worn and pale, and clutching her coat with both hands, looking like a woman who had made a very long journey on very little sleep. And beside her, holding her hand with the serious concentration of a small person navigating an unfamiliar place, was a dark-haired boy with dark eyes who tilted his head slightly when he saw the 2 strangers staring at him. The tilt, that specific, unmistakable tilt. Daphne heard the breath leave Harlan's body. She watched him look at Oliver for the first time. Watched the controlled, precise, relentlessly composed Duke of Crestmore go absolutely still, as if the world had suddenly rearranged itself around a fixed point he had not known he was missing. Oliver looked at him with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a 3-year-old. Then he looked at Daphne and said, in a small, clear voice, "Mama." And Daphne, who had not cried once in 3 years, felt something crack open behind her ribs, so wide and so sudden that she had to press her hand against her mouth to hold the rest of herself together. Harlan didn't look away from the boy. When he finally spoke, his voice was different from any version of it she had heard before. Lower, stripped of everything carefully, and controlled. How long has he been in that cottage? Since he was 4 months old, she said quietly. A long silence. He will never go back, Harlan said. It was not directed at her. It was not a negotiation. It was simply a fact, spoken by a man who had just seen something that permanently reordered every priority he had ever held. Daphne looked at him, at the line of his jaw, by the way his hands had closed at his sides, tight and still, at the man who had cornered her with legal papers and deadlines and cold precision, standing in complete silence in front of a 3-year-old boy who had his eyes. The deadline still stood. The claim still stood. None of that had moved. But something else had entered the room with Oliver. Something that had no name in legal folders or society arrangements. Something that made the walls of the corner she was standing in feel for the first time less like a trap and more like a shelter. She was not ready to say that out loud, but she felt it. And she suspected, from the way Harlan still had not looked away from his son, that he felt it too. The next morning came grey and cold, the kind of London morning that pressed down on everything and made the city feel smaller than it was. Daphne had not slept. She had lain on the narrow bed in the room Harlan's housekeeper had prepared for her at Harwick House, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of a house that was not hers, thinking about every decision that had brought her to this particular ceiling, in this particular house, on this particular night. She had not agreed to anything yet. She wanted that to be clear, at least to herself. She was here because Mrs. Alton had arrived unexpectedly, and because Oliver had looked at her with his father's eyes and said "Mama," and because at that moment, going back to Greywick Lane alone had felt like an act of deliberate cruelty to herself. She was here practically, not surrendered. That was what she told herself at 2 in the morning. By 4, she had stopped believing it. Oliver was sleeping in the room next to hers. She had checked on him twice already, standing in the doorway watching the small rise and fall of his chest, his dark hair fanned against the pillow, one fist curled under his chin. He looked peaceful in a way that he rarely looked in the Hertfordshire cottage, which had been warm enough and safe enough but always slightly too quiet, slightly too still for a child who had his particular energy. Here he had simply climbed into the bed, pulled the blanket to his chin, and gone to sleep, as if the house already belonged to him. She envied him, the uncomplicated trust of it. She heard movement downstairs at 5:30, and knew without question that it was Harlan. He had always been an early riser. She remembered that from Crestmore Hall, the way the library fire would already be lit when she came down at 6, the way there would always be evidence of him having been somewhere before the rest of the house woke. A book moved, a cup rinsed, a door left slightly ajar. She did not go downstairs. But she did not sleep either. At breakfast, which was a quiet and slightly careful affair with Mrs. Alton, looking between them both with the expression of a woman watching two people navigate something she understood better than they did, Oliver ate with focused enthusiasm and knocked over his cup of milk and looked up at the resulting mess with an expression of pure scientific interest rather than distress. Harlan, sitting at the opposite end of the small table, looked at the milk spreading across the cloth and then at Oliver, and said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his own napkin and leaned forward and began blotting the spill without any fuss whatsoever. Oliver watched him do this. Then he picked up his own napkin and began helping, pressing it flat against the cloth with both hands, very serious about it. Daphne watched them from across the table and felt that cracking sensation behind her ribs again, wider this time, less manageable. After breakfast, Harlan asked to speak with her privately. They went to the sitting room. He closed the door and stood near the fireplace and looked at her with an expression that was still controlled, but had something new underneath it, something that had been there since the moment Oliver walked into the room the previous evening and had not entirely left. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. "You owe me several," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "You are right." He looked at the fire for a moment. "I came to London with a plan. Papers, timelines, legal arrangements. I was going to corner you because I believed that was the only language you would hear after 3 years of silence." He paused. "I still believe the deadline was necessary. I am not apologizing for it. I did not ask you to. But I want you to understand something that was not in any of Mr. Price's documents," he continued. "When I walked into that sitting room last night and saw him," he stopped, started again. "I have been angry with you for 3 years, Daphne. Quietly, constantly angry. Not because you left, because you decided alone, because you looked at me and made a judgment about what I was capable of and did not give me the chance to be anything else." He met her eyes. "But when I saw Oliver, all of that became very small and very unimportant very quickly, and what was left was something I do not have a clean word for." She sat very still. "Try," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Gratitude," he said. "That you kept him safe. That you chose a hard road instead of an easier one that would have erased him. That he is healthy and whole and entirely himself." A pause. "And grief. For everything I missed." The room was quiet. Daphne looked at her hands in her lap. "I thought about telling you," she said. "More times than you would believe. I wrote letters I never sent. I stood at the edge of decisions and talked myself back every time." She looked up. "I was not only protecting Oliver. You were right about that. I was also protecting myself from a version of this, where you did the responsible thing but not the chosen thing, where I became an obligation, where he grew up watching his father tolerate his mother." Her voice remained steady through all of it, which continued to cost her. I could not survive that version. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. It is the most frightening thing I have ever said to you, she corrected. Something shifted in his face, not the controlled shift of a man managing his expression. Something genuine and unguarded, there and gone quickly, but she caught it. I am not asking you to stop being frightened, he said. I am asking you to be frightened and stay anyway. Before she could answer, the door to the sitting room opened, and Mr. Price stepped in, which he would not have done without cause. His face was tight. Your Grace, he said, I apologize for the interruption. There is a matter requiring immediate attention. He glanced at Daphne. It concerns Mr. Calder Fenn. Harlan straightened. What has he done? Mr. Price cleared his throat. He has filed a counter-petition. He is arguing that the child's parentage is fraudulent and that Miss Collis is engaged in a scheme to manufacture a false heir in order to extract financial support from the Varick estate. He set a document on the table. He has also, I am told, made contact with 2 members of the press. Daphne felt cold move through her. He is going to put Oliver's name in the papers. He intends to, said Mr. Price, before you can document the parentage legitimately. If the story runs first as a fraud claim, it poisons the ground. Harlan picked up the document. He read it in silence. His face did not change. That particular stillness of his, the kind that preceded action rather than inaction, settled over him completely. Get me Lord Ashby, he said to Mr. Price. Today, and find out which press contacts Fenn has approached. He set the document down. We move the timeline forward. How far forward? Said Mr. Price. As far as necessary, said Harlan. He looked at Daphne. I need you to trust me for the next 48 hours. You are asking a great deal, she said. I know, he said. I am asking anyway. She met his gaze, proud and exhausted, and still fighting even as she felt the ground beneath the fight becoming less solid. 48 hours, she said. He nodded. Then he was already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, the cold and capable machinery of him shifting into a gear she recognized as the thing that made him formidable. He called for his coat. He sent 2 messages by hand. He spoke in rapid, low tones with Mr. Price in the hallway. Daphne went upstairs to check on Oliver. She found him in the small room, awake now, sitting on the floor with a wooden horse that had appeared from somewhere in the house, moving it in careful circles on the floorboards. He looked up when she came in. Where did the horse come from? She asked. The man gave it, said Oliver. She went still. Which man? The tall man, said Oliver. At breakfast. He said it was his when he was small. She sat down on the floor beside her son and watched him move the wooden horse in its careful circles and thought about a man who had woken early and found a childhood toy and given it to a boy he had known for less than 12 hours. She was losing the fight. She could feel it happening. She was not entirely sure she minded anymore. The message from Mrs. Honoria Bletch arrived that afternoon, slipped under the front door without a knock. It was short. It said only, Fenn has hired men. Be careful with the child tonight. I'm sorry. I told you to choose your corner carefully. This is me telling you the same thing again, with more urgency. Daphne read it twice. Then she took it downstairs to the housekeeper, a solid and sensible woman named Mrs. Drum, and asked her to keep Oliver inside and close for the rest of the day. Mrs. Drum looked at the note. She asked no questions. She simply nodded and went to find Oliver. Daphne sent a message to Harlan. He was back within the hour.
Quiet now, miss. Something stirs beyond the door. Do not move. We must wait.
The attack came at nightfall. Not dramatic. Not announced. A scraping at the kitchen door that Mrs. Drum noticed first, quiet and deliberate, nothing like the wind. She came to Daphne with her voice low and her face steady. Someone is at the back. More than one. Daphne was already moving. She went to Oliver's room, lifted him from the floor, and held him against her shoulder. He was warm and trusting, and did not make a sound. Children sensed danger in the bodies of the people holding them. He pressed his face into her neck and went still. She moved to the top of the stairs. Below, the kitchen door gave a soft, resigned sound. 2 sets of footsteps. Careful. Then the front door opened hard and fast, and Harlan came through it. 2 large, quiet men behind him, and Mr. Price moving immediately toward the back of the house without being told. Harlan looked up and found her at the top of the stairs with Oliver on her shoulder. Something moved through his face, relief and fury at once, aimed at 2 entirely different things. He came up in 4 steps. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "We heard them and stayed up." He looked at Oliver. The boy looked back with wide, serious eyes. Harlan reached out and put one hand against the back of Oliver's head, instinctive and unplanned. Oliver leaned into it without hesitation. From below came the sounds of a short, decisive struggle. Then voices. Then silence. Mr. Price appeared at the bottom of the stairs holding a folded paper. 2 men. Both taken. Written instructions, signed at the bottom by a man who is not as careful as he believes. "Fen," said Harlan. "Fen," confirmed Mr. Price. "Get Lord Ashby's constables. Tonight, I want Fen in custody before he knows what has happened." Mr. Price was gone before the sentence finished. Daphne stood in the hallway holding her son and looked at the man who had come through that door without hesitation, without calculation, without a single thought for anything except reaching them. And she understood, with a clarity 3 years of distance had never produced, that she was done running. Not because he had cornered her, because he had chosen her. Repeatedly, deliberately, at considerable personal cost, he had chosen her. And she had been so afraid of becoming an obligation that she had never properly seen it. Calder Fen was arrested before 10 that evening. The 2 hired men went first, their written instructions entered into record. Fen himself was collected mid-supper from his townhouse on Berwick Street. The counter-petition collapsed within a day. The press contacts evaporated. Mr. Price filed the parentage documents the following morning, and by afternoon it was done. Mrs. Honoria Bletch sent a note. It said, "Well done. I was rooting for you. Both of you." That evening Daphne sat by the fire in the sitting room and heard Harlan come in. He sat across from her, tired for the first time, not broken, just settled, the way people look when something large has finally resolved. "I want to say something," she said. "Let me finish before you speak." He nodded. "I was wrong to run. Not wrong to be afraid, but wrong to decide for you without asking. Wrong to let 3 years pass without finding a braver way." She looked at him steadily. "I am not saying this because you have cornered me. I am saying it because it is true, and I am tired of carrying it." "I was not easy to approach," he said quietly. "I held people at a distance without meaning to. I did not make it simple for you to trust that staying would be safe." "No," she said honestly. "You did not." "I am aware," he said. "I'm working on it." The honesty of it took the last of her resistance apart completely. "If I agree to this," she said, "I need to understand that I am not agreeing because I have no choice. I am agreeing because I want to, because Oliver deserves a real home, and because I am tired of being afraid of something I have wanted for 3 years." "And what is that?" he said. "You," she said, which has always been the most inconvenient possible answer. He smiled, not the almost smile from the library years ago. A real one, reaching all the way to his eyes, changing his entire face. He crossed the room and sat beside her and took her hand and held it steadily, the way he did everything. They were married 3 weeks later. A quiet ceremony. Small church. Mr. Price cried into his handkerchief. Mrs. Drum looked deeply satisfied. Mrs. Alton held Oliver's hand throughout. Mrs. Bletch invited herself, and neither of them turned her away. Oliver stood between them with his wooden horse tucked under one arm. At one point, he looked up at Harlan and said, in a voice that carried clearly through the church, "Are you staying now?" Harlan crouched to his level and looked him directly in the eye. "Yes," he said. "I am staying." Oliver nodded and went back to the horse. Life at Crestmore Hall was not perfect. There were mornings when old fears surfaced, evenings when the weight of lost years settled quietly between them, moments when she caught herself waiting for something to go wrong. But Harlan was patient in the active way, learning her silences, leaving books with underlined passages on her desk, having the East Garden finished exactly as she had once mentioned she would like it. Oliver grew fast and loud and full of opinions, with his father's eyes and his mother's refusal to back down from anything. He asked questions constantly, and Harlan answered every single one. One evening Daphne sat in the Crestmore library reading by the fire. Harlan came in and stopped in the doorway, exactly as he had years ago, when she stood between his shelves with her first edition pressed to her chest. "What are you reading?" he said. She showed him the spine. "Keats," he said. "Ode to a Nightingale," she said. "I thought it was time I finished it properly." He crossed the room, sat beside her, took the book, and read aloud in a low, unhurried voice. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, Crestmore Hall stood warm and permanent in the dark. Oliver slept upstairs with his wooden horse on the pillow. And in the library, the Duke, who had once claimed her without mercy, held her gently instead, and read until the candles burned low and stayed. He had always intended to stay. She had simply needed time to believe it.